The massive silverback froze so suddenly that even the automatic enclosure gate seemed to hesitate with him. Coda had walked the same route every morning for nearly 8 years, never resisting, never showing fear, never stopping halfway between the outdoor habitat and the indoor shelter. Yet on this cool fall morning, he planted both hands against the concrete path and refused to take another single step. Around him, the zoo carried on with its familiar rhythm. Maintenance carts hummed across service roads, birds circled above the trees, and the first families of the day gathered outside the exhibit, unaware that something was quietly unraveling behind the scenes. Nathan Brooks, Coda's longtime keeper, frowned as he approached with the silver bucket that usually earned an eager response. "Come on, buddy," he called in the calm voice Coda had trusted for years. The gorilla didn't even glance at the treats. Instead, he stared directly at the open doorway leading into his enclosure, his broad shoulders tense, his breathing unusually slow, as if every instinct inside him was warning him not to cross that threshold. Nathan stopped a few feet away. This wasn't stubbornness. Coda had never ignored him before. He tried the familiar hand signal they had practiced thousands of times. Nothing. He shook the bucket lightly. Nothing. The silverback took one careful step backward instead, never breaking eye contact with the dark opening ahead. Visitors watching from the public viewing area began whispering. Some children giggled, thinking the enormous ape was simply being playful. Others noticed something stranger. Coda wasn't acting angry. He wasn't frightened either. He looked cautious, deliberate, as though he was waiting for someone else to notice what he already had. Nathan's radio crackled. "Status update," came the voice of Zoo Director Martin Reed. Nathan kept his eyes on Coda. "He's refusing to enter." There was a brief silence before Martin answered. "That's not like him." "No," Nathan replied quietly. "It isn't." Another keeper suggested closing off the outdoor yard until they could encourage him inside, but Nathan hesitated. Every time someone stepped closer to the enclosure entrance, Coda shifted sideways, placing his enormous body between the person and the doorway. He never charged. He never roared. He simply blocked the path with quiet determination, almost like a living barricade. Nathan felt an uneasy chill creep across his shoulders. Over hundreds of mornings, he had learned to recognize Coda's moods. Excitement looked different. Curiosity looked different. Even frustration had its own unmistakable signs. This behavior belonged to none of them. It was something Nathan had never seen before. Then Coda did something that made every conversation stop. The gorilla slowly lifted one arm, pointed toward the enclosure entrance with a single extended finger, and without making a sound, slowly shook his head. Nathan's heartbeat quickened. Before anyone could react, he looked down toward the doorway, and the color drained from his face. Coda did not move even after the other keepers quietly stepped back, leaving only Nathan standing a respectful distance away. The enormous silverback remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the entrance as though the familiar doorway had suddenly become something he no longer trusted. To everyone else, it looked like an unusual refusal. To Nathan, it felt painfully different. Over the years, Coda had become the easiest gorilla in the zoo to care for. He followed routines with quiet confidence, recognized the sound of Nathan's footsteps long before anyone else, and had developed small habits that only the two of them seemed to understand. Every morning, before entering the indoor habitat, Coda would pause just long enough for Nathan to offer a simple nod. It had become an unspoken ritual, one that never appeared in training manuals or animal behavior reports. Some visitors believed the gorilla was waiting for permission. Nathan always believed it was Coda's way of checking that everything was all right. That tiny routine had never been broken until today. Looking at the motionless silverback, Nathan realized something else that made his chest tighten. Coda had not accepted a single piece of food since sunrise. The apples, grapes, and leafy greens remained untouched beside the path. Even his favorite enrichment toy sat forgotten near a large rock. That alone was enough to raise concern because Coda rarely ignored breakfast, especially after spending the cool night outdoors. Yet he showed no signs of illness. His breathing remained steady. His posture was balanced. His attention never drifted. It was as though every ounce of his focus had been consumed by whatever waited beyond that doorway. Nathan quietly remembered another small change from the previous evening. During closing rounds, Coda had lingered outside much longer than usual. Instead of settling into his enclosure before sunset, he had sat facing the building in complete silence until darkness covered the exhibit. Nathan had assumed the gorilla simply wanted to enjoy the cooler air. Now that memory felt strangely important. Martin Reed approached again, speaking softly so the growing crowd would not overhear. He asked whether the veterinarian should prepare for a full examination. Nathan hesitated before answering. Something deep inside him resisted treating this as a medical issue. Coda was not behaving like an animal in pain. He was behaving like someone carrying a burden that nobody else could see. The thought sounded unreasonable, yet Nathan could not shake it. Coda slowly lowered himself onto the concrete path and folded his massive arms across his chest. It was a posture Nathan had seen only during quiet moments when the gorilla seemed thoughtful or uncertain. Minutes passed without a sound except distant conversations from visitors and the rustling leaves overhead. Then Coda lifted his head ever so slightly and looked directly at Nathan again. There was no panic in those eyes. No anger. No fear. Only a calm, patient expression that almost seemed to ask him to wait. Nathan followed the gorilla's gaze back toward the enclosure entrance once more, and for the first time he noticed a faint rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere beyond the open doorway, a sound he had never heard before. Coda remained seated for another long minute while the faint tapping continued somewhere beyond the open doorway. Nathan could not tell whether the sound came from inside the enclosure or beneath it, but the silverback reacted every single time it repeated. Instead of staring at the entrance, Coda slowly turned his head as though tracking the vibration through the ground itself. Then he did something Nathan had never witnessed in 8 years. The gorilla lowered one massive hand onto the concrete, spread his fingers wide, and remained perfectly still. His eyes closed for only a second before opening again, almost as if he had been listening through the floor rather than with his ears. Nathan exchanged a puzzled glance with the nearby keepers. No one spoke. The behavior did not resemble fear, aggression, or confusion. It looked purposeful. A maintenance employee approached from the service path, unaware of the unusual situation, carrying a toolbox toward the indoor habitat. The moment the man stepped within a few yards of the entrance, Coda rose with surprising speed. He did not rush forward or threaten anyone. Instead, he calmly crossed the path and positioned himself directly between the employee and the doorway, refusing to move. The worker laughed nervously, assuming the gorilla wanted attention, but Nathan quietly asked him to wait where he was. Coda remained motionless until the employee stepped backward. Only then did the silverback return to his original position. Visitors gathered behind the viewing glass whispered among themselves. Some believed Coda had become territorial. Others wondered if he was preparing for a sudden outburst. Nathan found neither explanation convincing. Every action seemed measured, almost careful, as though Coda was following a rule that no one else could understand. Minutes later, another keeper rolled a cleaning cart toward the same entrance. Once again, Coda reacted before anyone said a word. He walked across the path, gently placed one hand on the front wheel of the cart, and held it in place without using force. The keeper instinctively stopped pushing. Coda released the wheel immediately and stepped away, never making eye contact with the cart itself. His attention remained fixed on the open doorway. Nathan's heartbeat grew heavier. Whatever Coda was trying to communicate, it was not random. Yet, there was no obvious danger. The building looked exactly as it had every other morning. The lights were on. The ventilation system sounded normal. Nothing appeared broken. Martin Reed arrived with Dr. Olivia Hayes, who quietly observed from a distance. Neither wanted to increase Coda's stress. Olivia watched the silverback's posture carefully before speaking in a low voice. "He is not trying to keep people away from himself," she said. "He is trying to keep them away from that entrance." The words settled over the group in uneasy silence. Before anyone could decide what to do next, Coda slowly walked toward the concrete wall beside the doorway, lifted one closed fist, and struck the same exact spot 3 times with steady precision. He stepped back, waited several seconds, and repeated the pattern without looking at anyone, as though he was trying to draw their attention to something hidden just beyond the wall. The steady knocking echoed through the service corridor until every employee nearby had stopped what they were doing. No one could explain why Coda continued striking the exact same place on the wall with such careful precision, but the unusual behavior was beginning to create a different kind of concern. Families outside the exhibit noticed the gathering of staff members, and a quiet wave of uncertainty spread through the crowd. Martin Reed glanced toward the growing line of visitors before lowering his voice. "We cannot leave the exhibit like this all morning," he said. "People are already asking questions." Nathan wanted more time. Every instinct told him Coda was trying to communicate something rather than simply refusing to cooperate, but he had nothing concrete to support that belief. From the perspective of everyone else, the situation looked increasingly unpredictable. Dr. Olivia Hayes reviewed Coda's recent health records on her tablet. His appetite had been normal until that morning. His routine had been consistent, and every recent examination had shown a healthy adult gorilla. Yet unusual behavior without an obvious medical explanation could still indicate stress, confusion, or an environmental change that people had not yet identified. She recommended moving visitors away from the exhibit until they understood what was happening. As security staff redirected guests to nearby attractions, several employees quietly exchanged theories. One believed construction noise from another section of the zoo had disturbed Coda. Another suggested he might be reacting to a scent carried by the morning breeze. Someone else wondered whether the repeated knocking meant he had developed a compulsive habit overnight. None of the explanations satisfied Nathan. He watched Coda carefully and noticed something that made him hesitate. Every time another employee approached the entrance, the silverback immediately stopped knocking and calmly stepped into their path. The moment they backed away, he returned to the wall and resumed the same measured pattern. There was no panic, no display of dominance, and no attempt to intimidate anyone. It looked less like defiance than determination. Unfortunately, that distinction was becoming harder for the others to see. Martin sighed heavily. "We cannot postpone routine operations any longer," he said. "If Coda continues blocking access, we have to consider that he may no longer be responding safely to normal procedures." Nathan immediately disagreed, but Martin reminded him that his responsibility extended to staff, visitors, and the animal itself. If the situation escalated further, delaying action could create unnecessary risk. Olivia remained thoughtful for several moments before speaking. "If we temporarily relocate Coda to the secondary holding area, we can inspect the enclosure without anyone nearby. It would also allow us to perform a precautionary examination." Nathan knew the proposal sounded reasonable. Even so, something about separating Coda from the entrance felt profoundly wrong. The silverback had not asked for food, attention, or freedom. He had asked, in every way he knew how, for people to stay away from one specific place. Yet without evidence, Nathan's concerns sounded more like emotion than judgment. Martin finally made his decision. He instructed the team to prepare the secondary holding area and begin the relocation procedure, convinced it was the safest option available. As the staff quietly dispersed to carry out the order, Nathan looked back at Coda. The gorilla seemed to understand exactly what they had decided, and for the first time that morning, he slowly lowered his head, as though he knew no one had believed him. As preparations quietly began for the transfer, Dr. Olivia Hayes remained standing near the service corridor instead of joining the others. Something continued to trouble her. Coda had ignored food, routines, and commands, yet every unusual action had revolved around one exact location. Animals under ordinary stress rarely behaved with that level of consistency. They wandered, retreated, vocalized, or became distracted. Coda had done none of those things. He had focused on a single doorway with almost mathematical precision. While the relocation crate was being rolled into position, Olivia walked toward the maintenance records hanging on a nearby clipboard. She was not searching for anything specific, only hoping to rule out obvious explanations before Coda was moved. Most of the inspection forms looked routine until one entry from the previous afternoon caught her attention. An electrical contractor had completed a short repair inside the building after a brief interruption in one section of the ventilation system. According to the report, everything had passed inspection before the crew left. Olivia almost returned the clipboard without another thought. Then she noticed something unusual. The completion time on the repair log was nearly 40 minutes later than the digital maintenance system showed for the same work order. It was a small discrepancy, perhaps nothing more than a paperwork mistake, but it was enough to make her pause. She quietly walked toward Nathan, who was watching Coda from across the path. Without saying a word, she handed him the clipboard. Nathan read the times twice before looking back toward the building. Neither of them spoke because neither wanted to jump to conclusions over a clerical error. Just then, another maintenance employee arrived carrying a handheld environmental meter used for checking air quality inside animal facilities. Before the employee reached the entrance, the instrument resting against his leg emitted a soft vibration as it powered on. Coda reacted instantly. He turned toward the device rather than the man carrying it. For only a brief moment, the silverback tilted his head, listening, and then calmly stepped sideways until the employee stopped walking. The reaction lasted only seconds, but Olivia noticed something important. Coda had not responded to the person. He had responded to the equipment. The observation lingered in her mind long after the employee backed away. Nathan quietly borrowed the handheld meter and switched it off. Coda remained completely still. When Nathan powered it back on from several yards away, the gorilla immediately looked toward the device again before shifting his attention back to the enclosure entrance. Olivia felt a slow chill spread across her shoulders. Whatever Coda was detecting seemed connected to something people could not naturally sense. It was not a smell. It was not movement. It was not the presence of strangers. Nathan looked once more at the inconsistent repair log, then toward the silent building that had seemed perfectly ordinary all morning. Martin Reed called from across the yard, asking whether the relocation team was ready. Nathan folded the clipboard under his arm instead of answering immediately. He finally met Olivia's eyes and spoke in a quiet voice. "Before anyone moves, Coda, I want every inch of that building checked again from the outside. Something is not adding up, and I am not willing to ignore it anymore." Martin reluctantly agreed to delay the relocation for only a few more minutes while Nathan and Olivia carried out one last inspection from outside the enclosure. Rather than entering the building, they followed the exterior maintenance corridor that ran behind the habitat, tracing the wall Coda had repeatedly indicated. The faint tapping sound had disappeared, replaced by an almost imperceptible humming that neither of them had noticed before. Nathan switched on the handheld environmental meter and held it close to the concrete. The display remained normal for several feet before suddenly flashing an unexpected warning. Olivia frowned and asked him to move the device back. The reading immediately returned to normal. He advanced again toward the section Coda had been striking, and once more the numbers climbed sharply before dropping just as quickly. Neither of them spoke. Olivia contacted the zoo's facilities supervisor, who arrived carrying specialized diagnostic equipment used for inspecting concealed utility lines. Within minutes, he scanned the wall and paused. "That should not be there," he murmured, staring at the screen. Beneath the concrete floor, directly under the entrance to the enclosure, an electrical conduit had filled with water after the previous day's repair. The damaged insulation was allowing intermittent electrical current to travel into the reinforced steel framework hidden beneath the threshold. The current was weak enough that people walking nearby might never notice it, yet strong enough to create an unpredictable hazard whenever the automatic door completed its operating cycle. The supervisor carefully isolated the circuit before opening an inspection panel. As soon as the damaged section became visible, everyone understood why the readings had changed throughout the morning. Moisture continued dripping onto exposed components that should never have been left vulnerable. Nathan slowly looked back toward Coda. Every action from the entire morning suddenly fit together. The gorilla had refused to cross the threshold. He had blocked every person who approached it. He had ignored food, routines, and commands because none of those things mattered compared to keeping others away from the danger. Even the repeated knocks against the wall had not been random. They had marked the exact location beneath which the hidden problem lay. Olivia quietly shook her head in disbelief. "He was not refusing to cooperate," she whispered. "He was warning us." Nathan felt a weight settle in his chest as memory after memory replayed in his mind. Coda had never shown fear for himself. Instead, he had calmly intercepted every employee who unknowingly walked toward the entrance, placing his own body between them and the unseen hazard. The realization left the entire team standing in silence. Martin lowered his eyes, realizing that only minutes earlier he had authorized moving the very animal who had been trying to protect everyone else. Nathan looked at Coda across the yard. The silverback remained exactly where he had been all morning, watching quietly without triumph or anger, And in that still moment, Nathan understood that they had mistaken extraordinary awareness for disobedience. He removed his radio, took a slow breath, and whispered almost to himself, "You were trying to save us, and we nearly stopped listening." Coda did not celebrate when the danger was finally understood. He simply remained where he was, calm and silent, watching the people who had spent the entire morning trying to convince him that he was wrong. That quiet patience somehow made the realization even heavier. Nathan slowly walked toward the safe boundary of the habitat and stopped where he and Coda had shared countless ordinary mornings together. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to speak. Every memory from the day returned with painful clarity. The untouched bucket of fruit, the careful way Coda had blocked each employee without frightening anyone, the deliberate knocks against the wall, the strange pauses before every movement. None of it had been random. Every decision the gorilla made had carried a purpose that the humans had failed to understand. Martin Reed removed the relocation paperwork from his clipboard and looked at it for several long seconds before quietly folding it in half. The order that had seemed responsible only minutes earlier now felt like a reminder of how quickly assumptions could overpower careful observation. Around them, the staff members who had prepared the holding area gradually stopped working. No one gave instructions. No one hurried to finish another task. They simply watched Coda with an entirely different perspective than they had when the morning began. Dr. Olivia Hayes slowly approached Nathan and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She admitted that even with years of studying animal behavior, she had almost overlooked the one thing Coda had been trying to communicate. She had searched for illness, stress, and routine. Disruption because those were the explanations people expected. She had not expected an animal to recognize a hidden environmental hazard before any instrument confirmed it. Nathan nodded silently. What stayed with him most was not that Coda had sensed the danger. It was that he had never once chosen the easier path of walking away. He could have retreated to the far side of the yard and left the humans to discover the problem on their own. Instead, he had spent hours placing himself between every person and the unseen risk, repeating the same warning again and again with remarkable patience. Several maintenance employees quietly thanked Nathan for insisting on one final inspection. Nathan gently shook his head. "Do not thank me," he replied. "I almost made the same mistake as everyone else." His eyes never left Coda. The gratitude belonged elsewhere. Martin took a slow breath before addressing the entire team. Effective immediately, all relocation plans were canceled. The enclosure would remain closed until every electrical and structural system had been independently inspected from top to bottom, regardless of how long it required. No one questioned the decision. It no longer felt like an inconvenience. It felt like the least they owed the animal who had protected them. Nathan picked up the untouched bucket of fruit and carried it toward the familiar spot near the entrance, setting it down without asking Coda to come closer or perform a single command. This time there were no expectations, only respect. Looking at the silverback, Nathan quietly made a promise that the others could hear, but Coda could never fully understand in words. From that moment forward, they would stop asking only whether the gorilla was listening to them. They would begin asking whether they had been listening carefully enough to him. Coda remained in the outdoor habitat while technicians carefully replaced the damaged electrical components and inspected every hidden section beneath the enclosure entrance. The work continued throughout the afternoon, yet no one attempted to persuade him to move before every system had been tested repeatedly. That decision alone changed something subtle. Between the people and the great silverback, instead of expecting obedience, they chose patience. Nathan stayed nearby for nearly the entire repair, not because Coda required supervision, but because he wanted the gorilla to know he would no longer ignore the warning that had been given so clearly. He sat quietly on the opposite side of the safety barrier with the untouched bucket of fruit still resting beside him. Occasionally, Coda glanced toward Nathan, then back toward the maintenance crews, calmly observing every step as if making certain the work was truly being completed. By late afternoon, the facility's supervisor returned with the final inspection report. Every electrical circuit had been replaced, the damaged conduit had been sealed, additional sensors had been installed beneath the entrance, and a second independent safety system had been added to monitor the area continuously. The supervisor personally demonstrated each safeguard before signing the report. Martin Reed quietly gathered the staff together and announced that the enclosure would not reopen until Coda chose to enter on his own. No commands would be given. No routines would be forced. Everyone agreed without hesitation. As the sun drifted lower across the zoo, Nathan slowly stood and walked to the familiar spot where he had greeted Coda every morning for years. He did not hold up food. He did not make the usual hand signal. Instead, he simply rested one hand against the protective glass and waited in silence. For several long moments, nothing happened. A cool breeze stirred the leaves above the habitat, and the afternoon visitors watched without speaking. Then Coda arose from his place beneath the trees. He walked toward the entrance with the same measured confidence he had always carried, stopping only briefly at the threshold. The silverback lowered one hand to the concrete exactly where he had paused that morning. He remained there for a heartbeat, almost as if confirming that the unseen danger had truly disappeared. Satisfied, he calmly crossed into the enclosure without the slightest sign of hesitation. A quiet sigh spread through the staff standing nearby. Nathan smiled with visible relief, not because Coda had followed a routine again, but because the decision had belonged entirely to him. Once inside, Coda turned back toward the viewing window instead of disappearing into the habitat. He looked directly at Nathan for several seconds before gently touching the inside of the glass with the tips of his fingers. Nathan slowly mirrored the gesture from the opposite side. No words could bridge the distance between them, yet none seemed necessary. Around them, the zoo gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm. But for the people who had witnessed the day unfold, something fundamental had changed. They no longer saw Coda simply as an animal under their care. They saw an intelligent being whose actions deserved attention, whose judgment had protected lives, and whose trust had been earned again not through commands, but through the simple choice to finally listen. In the weeks that followed, life at the zoo settled back into its familiar rhythm, but the people who worked there quietly admitted that something inside them had changed forever. The repaired enclosure became one of the safest habitats in the entire facility, not because new equipment had been installed, but because every inspection now began with a simple question that had never been asked before. Before checking a report, before trusting a monitor, before assuming everything was normal, the keepers paused to observe the animals themselves. Coda never seemed interested in the attention that followed the incident. He returned to his usual routines with the same calm dignity he had always carried. He greeted the mornings in silence, explored his habitat, accepted meals with quiet confidence, and spent long afternoons watching visitors through the glass with gentle curiosity. Yet there was one small change that Nathan noticed almost immediately. Every morning, before Coda entered the enclosure, he still paused at the threshold, but now Nathan no longer hurried him or encouraged him forward. Instead, the two shared a brief moment of stillness. Nathan would simply wait, allowing Coda all the time he needed to make his own decision. It became a new ritual built not on habit, but on mutual respect. Months later, a group of newly hired keepers gathered for their first training session. Rather than beginning with manuals or safety charts, Martin Reed led them to Coda's habitat. Standing quietly beside the viewing window, he told them the story of a morning when every alarm, every schedule, and every assumption had almost drowned out the one warning that mattered most. He explained that experience and technology were invaluable, but neither could replace careful observation or humble curiosity. Olivia added that understanding an animal was never about forcing it to fit human expectations. Sometimes the greatest responsibility was recognizing that another living being might notice something people could not yet explain. Nathan listened without interrupting. When the orientation ended and the visitors drifted away, he remained near the habitat as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Coda wandered toward the familiar entrance, paused for a moment as he always did, then calmly crossed the threshold without hesitation. Before disappearing inside, the silverback glanced back toward Nathan one last time. There was nothing dramatic in the moment. No grand gesture. No performance. Only a quiet look that carried years of trust rebuilt through a single decision to finally listen instead of assuming. Nathan smiled to himself, realizing that the greatest lesson of that extraordinary day had never been about hidden wires or damaged equipment. It had been about the invisible distance that can grow whenever people stop paying attention to those who cannot speak their language. Some voices are heard with ears. The wisest ones are heard with humility.